because I know that this is one of your phrases, that bad faith changes everything in a conversation. This seems like a very interesting point, like the conversation, the bad faith, good faith, because it's often used, and I've seen it used often now as a way of sort of policing who can take part in discussions, who you're willing to have on your show, for example, and there seems to be no obvious definition. Like bad faith is almost always something that someone will say about someone else, but it will never be, no one would accept that description of themselves. So how can you define bad faith and good faith, and how can you know whether, and how do you know if that's being used erroneously as a way of keeping someone out of the conversation who should actually be part of the conversation and should challenge you in some way?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say a couple things. One, there is an issue with certain parameters that they fail at the point you attempt to operationalize them. So to the extent that good faith has a value in conversation, it may be true that just simply recognizing that there is something, even if we can't be certain if we detect it, that there is a state and we can define it, and that state ought to distinguish between your viability in a conversation and the need to bar you from it. So I would say, loosely speaking, good faith, not as lawyers use the term because it has a very particular definition as a term of art in the law, but in common parlance, I would say the sine qua non of good faith is whether or not a person is acting with reference to the goal that they state. In other words, if somebody says, this is my objective, and then they say something or take an action with the earnest belief that they are actually moving towards that objective, that's good faith. Even if they're wrong, even if what they're doing is monstrous, just the simple fact that they are telling you, here's the objective, and then the action matches the objective. What people do that is not in good faith is they provide a misleading objective. That's the easiest place to mislead. And then they pretend that their statements or their actions are actually an attempt to reach that objective when really they're an attempt to reach some unstated objective. So can you detect this? Yes, you can detect it. Can you do so absolutely reliably? No, but if you have enough data on a particular individual's behavior, bad faith becomes evident over time because believing in X could not possibly result in these statements and behaviors, which are counterproductive with relevance with respect to the objective. So, bad faith emerges. Can you detect bad faith suddenly? Can somebody do something that calls your attention to the likelihood that they're acting in bad faith? Yep, you can definitely see it. Could you be mistaken? That can happen also, but that will also become clear over time. So what I would say is somebody who is sensitive to tracking the match of a model to the actual manifest behavior can see these things. And it's actually not unlike what we do in animal behavior. Animals, non-human animals, they never tell you what they're up to, right? You have to be able to figure it out based on the fact that you have a model. This is what I think the animal is trying to accomplish. And then if I watch the animal continuing to behave, its behavior matches that objective. Or here's what I think is happening, and then no, actually what it's doing wouldn't make any sense if that's what it was trying to accomplish. So it must be trying to accomplish something different. This is the same thing. It's basically ethnology versus ethology.
So in this context, I guess the key distinctions we're making in sort of conversation is, are you oriented towards truth, or are you oriented to winning the interaction and making the other person look bad?
Well,
would that be a key distinction? Or?
I have no problem with somebody is not inherently acting in bad faith if they're trying to win and make the other person look bad, as long as they acknowledge that that's what they're up to, right? But if somebody says, look, I am much more interested in discovering the truth than winning, and then they behave like somebody who's more interested in winning than discovering the truth, that's bad faith. It's the mismatch between the objective and the apparent objective and the stated objective. So I don't really have any interest in participating with somebody who's just looking to score points, but the challenge that they are acting in bad faith really depends on the fact that they don't admit that that's what they're doing.
I guess the complexity for me is that very few people are actually, a lot of people who think they're acting in good faith and get very upset if you say, no, you're a bad faith actor, genuinely don't know or can't tell that that's what they're doing. Like we could probably come up with 2 or 3 names of people who would be very, very upset if you said you're actually a bad faith actor and genuinely believe that they're actually trying to kind of approach truth and would argue that that's what they're trying to do. So how do you get past this just being a subjective judgment by someone who maybe doesn't want to engage?
Well, first of all, let us be clear. I think a lot of people make the error that because they believe their motives to be positive, that is the same thing as acting in good faith. And the problem is it's very easy to rationalize behaviors that are harmful to others and to paint some sort of positive spin on them. So it's not a question of whether your internal motives are decent. That's an important question, but there's too much room for rationalization for us to figure it out. But really, a mismatch between your stated objective and the objective revealed by your behaviors is certainly reason for a red flag. This also means that you have an obligation to search your own mind to discover if, in fact, there's a rationale for your behavior that you're not aware of or only dimly aware of, and you're keeping it out of your own sight in order to prevent the knowledge of it from causing you to be guilty of bad faith. But a person who is willing to search their own mind and say, look, I don't know for sure. I'm a human being, which means that most of what goes on in my head is invisible to me too. But to the extent that I check my own motives, it's not that I'm privately aware of something and pursuing it and not telling you about it. As far as I know, what I'm saying is my actual belief, and it is based on the things that I've told you it's based on. Now, what we do with the difference between the abstract question, does bad faith exist? It absolutely does. Does something else exist that we might call good faith? It absolutely does. Can you detect these things from the outside? Yes, but it takes a pattern, right? What do we do with the accusation? So we've got the personal fact of acting in good or bad faith. We've got the suspicion by somebody else based on a pattern of behavior. And then we've got the accusation, which might be used to keep somebody out of a discussion. And the problem is, we can't convict somebody of bad faith unless there's really substantial evidence that they are stating an incorrect motive, that they have reason to know that that's what they are doing, or if they don't know, that they've been avoiding it so as not to know, right? Those are the issues. But we never have, or almost never have, the level of proof that would exist for convicting a person of a crime, for example. Did you commit the crime? The evidence says beyond a reasonable doubt that you did, right? That's something we can prove. But when we're talking about your internal motivation, it's much harder to prove. And so, as a bar, we have to understand that we are not really claiming the right to exclude somebody from a public good. But in a conversation, I'm not participating in a public good. I'm participating in a conversation whose very nature depends on the ability to exclude that which is counterproductive. If I suspect somebody is acting in bad faith and I don't want them in a conversation that I'm participating in, then the point is, well, I don't want to participate in that conversation if that person is present. So my participation is contingent on those that I suspect are not acting in good faith not being present for it. You don't want to watch that conversation? Don't watch it, right? This isn't like I'm saying that person can't come into a public park because they're acting in bad faith.
I guess the other question, and this may sound very naive, but is it always necessary to exclude those who you suspect might be bad faith or might sometimes be bad faith from conversations? Or on one level, why not have the conversation with them and call it out in real time and let the audience make up their minds?
That can be useful, but I would say there's a simple question of opportunity cost. I don't have time in the rest of my life for even all of the conversations I might have with people who are very careful about their own motivations and very earnestly motivated to do positive things in the world. There's just a limit on how many hours there are left. Should I spend some of those hours engaging with people who are being deceptive about their own beliefs? Maybe. Maybe
you might be able to expose them, for example.
Well, sure. I'd be willing to do that, but then I wouldn't exactly bar them from a conversation. If my purpose was to expose their bad faith, I would agree to participate in it. So on rare occasion, it may make sense to have those conversations. But in general, the ability of a person acting in bad faith to snarl a conversation so that it goes nowhere productive is much greater than the ability of somebody acting in good faith to establish what's really going on in somebody else's head or that they're a charlatan or whatever. So we should spend our time where it's productive. And in general, my experience tells me that interacting with people who are acting in clear good faith is far more productive.